Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's Thursday and our exciting weekly EU DisinfoLab webinar is kicking off today with a topic that it's not often addressed, but it's highly relevant: the dynamic of disinformation when targeting businesses and how the effects of well-crafted false content can go viral within hours, reaching millions of people and leaving a trail of destructions on brands. But before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. So first, this session, as you may notice, it's being recorded, and the replay will be available in a couple of days on our website and on our YouTube channel. Also relevant, during the Q&A, we are going to use the tool Slido. You can already start connecting to this tool by scanning the QR code that you see on the screen, or also by typing slido.com and using the hashtag disinfo. So to kick things off and to get familiar, to get acquainted with the tool Slido, you can start, as I said, scanning the code. And would you please let us know where are you joining us from today? All right, let's wait a few seconds. I know for sure that we have a bunch of people in the room, so we can maybe, well, in the meantime, so you know, Ana Romero, a researcher at EU DisinfoLab, and I'll be serving as your moderator during this webinar today. I can see that there are a couple of participants typing. Anyway, I think we can move forward. We can get back to this later. So yeah, I can, okay, so London, Paris, Moldova. Which sector do you represent? All right, it's a bit messy in my screen, but next question would be to let me know, to let us know which sector do you represent. Okay, 50-50, business and others. Academia, 33%. All right, thank you very much, everyone. Now, I'd like to warmly welcome our speaker, Rafi Mendelsohn. I am particularly excited to have him with us because he's bringing a different topic. But wait for it. Let me first introduce you to Rafi. It's a marketing leader with over a decade of experience. He's been a mentor for startups and currently holds the VP position at Cyabra. Rafi, we are used to discussing disinformation that targets climate change, gender, identity issues, disinformation over migrants, disinformation that fuels political polarization, etc. But disinformation also infiltrates our daily lives as consumer of products and services. It shapes our decisions about what we buy or who we trust, while simultaneously damage the image of brands. And how difficult it's to know what is true and what's false, especially when it comes to sensitive things such as nourishment products. I personally remember being a child and everyone was scared because it was said that Pepsi cans had needles and syringes in them. Of course, Pepsi cans were never brought into my house again. And if I'm not mistaken, an investigation progressed and a good number of people were arrested for tampering. And I think it was discovered that the whole thing had been an act of sabotage beyond the company's control and responsibility. So this is just an example, but there are thousands out there. And now we are going to explore the evolving landscape of brand disinformation, uncovering the tactics used to target companies on social media and unveiling who is behind these attacks and where they come from as well. Everyone, welcome to the webinar When Disinformation Hits Companies, Safeguards for Brand Reputation and Protection. Rafi Mendelsohn, you should be able to share your screen now. So go ahead and see you later during the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the introduction, Anna. It's a real pleasure to be here. Having been a keen digester, reader, follower, watcher of many of the EU DisinfoLab's content, it's a little bit daunting, but actually quite exciting to be here with you today. So we're going to be covering brand disinformation, as we said. I'm Rafi Mendelsohn. Nice to meet you. I come from a company called Cyabra. We're probably going to spend about 30 seconds talking about Cyabra, no more, and then we're going to move on to the topic at hand, which I know everyone is excited to join. Thank you so much for joining from around the world. It's amazing that you're all able to join from various different times. Yeah, looking forward to the questions at the end. So, following on from our good friend, Mr. Lincoln, I am guessing that anyone who is registering for an EU DisinfoLab webinar is fully aware of the challenges of disinformation, right? We're kind of amongst friends in this room that we know, a basic idea of the challenges, etc. And as Anna said, elections and the kind of common use cases around public health and vaccine, etc. Which is something that Cyabra is steeped in and has a lot of experience. But actually today, we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about something else and something that is a little bit newer, and we're going to be backing it up with some of the insights and analysis that we've covered. So to kick things off, just to introduce ourselves, as I mentioned, we are Cyabra. We're a company that's developed technology that services both the public sector, governments around the world, and also increasingly businesses and brands, as we're going to see. And we are dedicated. Our mission is to fight disinformation and bring a little bit of trust back into the online sphere by uncovering malicious actors, bot networks, and fake and Gen AI created content. And so we like to say sometimes that we uncover the good, bad, and fake online. That's really what we kind of wake up every morning in order to be able to do. And we've developed technologies to be able to do that. One just last slide about us, and before we move on, is that on the right-hand side, we had a really interesting insight and perspective and experience of a couple of years ago when a certain Mr. Musk was looking to acquire Twitter, as it was known then. And as I'm sure you all remember, there was an interesting conversation just about the number of fake accounts involved on Twitter. And Twitter was saying one number, and Elon Musk was saying another number. And actually, we were brought on board and hired by Musk and his team, because that's what we do at scale, being able to understand how many fake accounts are engaging in the conversation, who's behind them, what are the kind of narratives. But on this occasion, it was purely around how many fake accounts are there, and we were able to give our insights, give our analysis, and run the data. And it wasn't 5%, like Twitter said. It wasn't 20%, like Musk said. It was around 11 to 13%. Still a pretty high number, and that's only the raw number of it, as opposed to the proportion of the conversation that the fake accounts are actually dominating. And so that was a really interesting experience. And since then we've been kind of bystanders and looking at the changes that have taken place on X. But that was a really interesting experience. And on the other side of the screen is one of the parts of our technology that a lot of people take a lot of interest in, and that's really how we detect fake accounts, which might be, in fact, one of the questions that you're typing out right now. So just to preempt that, we're not fact checking. We are looking at the behavioral parameters. In fact, we're looking at hundreds of different behavioral parameters to understand exactly how does a profile behave, and are they showing authentic or inauthentic behaviors. And so, for example, we might be looking and seeing, Anna, sorry to pick on you, but is Anna posting 23 of the 24 hours of the day? Does she claim to be in one country, but actually she's posting in 6 different languages, and that's not the language of the country she's in? What time of day is she posting? Who are the kind of people that she engages with? Who engages with her? What does her profile look like? So we look at hundreds of different behavioral parameters at scale in real time to be able to understand if Anna is in fact real or fake. The good news is Anna is real. You don't need me to tell you that. And so that's often a question we get asked, and that's the technology, the AI technology. So we're going to be discussing about AI, Gen AI, the impact of that, how that works. But actually, what we do is we're looking at the AI itself, etc. And so to go on to the next slide, this may be a framework that you yourselves have seen. And it may be something that you're familiar with, but it's definitely something that Cyabra really follows very, very closely. And that's the ABC of disinformation. And so many of you might be familiar with this concept and the framework. And in fact, you might be aware of other letters to it, but we're going to stick with ABC for now. And this is really the way that we think, and Cyabra is always thinking about the way that malicious actors are thinking about disinformation, how they're preparing for it. I personally find this a very helpful framework to understand exactly the way we can break down disinformation. And the reason why we want to do that is to be able to understand, okay, well, how do we actually identify it, uncover it, and then act on that? And so the ABC is actors, behaviors, and content. The actors is what kind of fake accounts, what accounts are being created. Are they bots? Are they sock puppets? Are they a combination of? And how many of them need to be created in order to conduct that operation? And that often is happening in the pre-planning stages, as well as other things. And so what kind of fake accounts do we need? And then once you have created your fake accounts, your online foot soldiers, as it were, how do you want them to behave? How do you want them to interact and engage with each other? And how do you want them engaging and interacting with real accounts? And then the third part is the content. What kind of content are those accounts, are those fake accounts actually going to be pushing out? What's the kind of narrative that they're going to be pushing out and sharing, distributing? And that could be images, and it could be videos, deep fakes, cheap fakes, as we've heard the concept recently, the new term, but also as well, it could be kind of fake audio. But really, also to emphasize the bulk of what we see is fake text, Gen AI created text. And think about it from the perspective of that malicious actor. If you are looking to conduct that campaign, you're looking to push a certain narrative, especially if English isn't your first language, the ability previously to create content, create text at scale was more limited. And now it's certainly not limited. And these kinds of tools, as great as they are, and we're all using Gen AI tools on a daily basis, probably. And there's, we haven't even reached the potential of the capabilities of what we can do for good. It's not about the technology itself, but actually it's about the way it's being used. And certainly malicious actors have taken up the use of Gen AI content in order to be able to create better, more believable content, in order to create better, more believable fake accounts as well. But certainly the content pillar of the ABC of disinformation is where we've seen Gen AI having the biggest impact. And so those barriers to creating the A, B, and C has actually come down to a level unprecedented before, which means that it makes it easier for threat actors and for whatever motivation. We're going to be coming onto that a little bit later, who exactly they are, but it's easier than ever for them to be able to do that. And so that's the ABC of disinformation, and that might be a concept you've come across. And if it's not, and you have questions on that, feel free to ask. As Anna mentioned before, we hear about the use cases and the applications and the challenges of disinformation, and we're pretty well versed in terms of elections. There's an election taking place right now in the UK, my home country, and there are elections happening all around. And this year in particular, there are elections more than ever. But that's not the focus of today's webinar. That's not the reason why you joined today. We're actually going to be talking about brand disinformation. Brand disinformation is interesting because it seems to be a growing problem, and the kind of tactics and techniques that we have seen that were applied around elections, around health disinformation, around other applications that you might have considered the domain of public sector or national security is actually something that those techniques are now being applied in other ways. And so in terms of brands being impacted, we're seeing from impersonations, false narratives being spread about brands through brand disinformations and influence operations, engaging and involving, amplifying crisis management, whether that's a certain narrative or a hashtag. We're going to come on to that in a second. And we're seeing lots of different examples, executive protection. There are senior executives around the world whose companies are paying a lot of money to have a bodyguard and to have that physical protection. But actually, more and more on social media, their information is being exposed. They're being targeted. doesn't have to be an executive, individuals, employees on all levels, and they're looking to be targeted, or in fact they're being impersonated, and we can see lots of examples of impersonations of individuals and of companies, and also event and venue risk management, which is something where we see the conversation taking place on social, and it's morphing and aimed at the physical space, whether that's a protest or whether that's destruction aimed at buildings or employees. And so we're seeing more and more, but of course, don't take my word for it. What we're going to be doing over the next few minutes is going through specific examples, but really breaking it down by the kinds of buckets, the kinds of triggers that we see. Many brands are turning, and we're having turning to Cyabra, and we're having conversations with brands or their agencies, and they're saying, we're seeing this, and we think we know what's happening, but all of a sudden it morphs from an issue into a crisis, and we're not really sure exactly what's going on here. So I'm going to be going through the 5 examples, the 5 times that brands might find themselves under attack and being targeted, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally on social media, driven by fake accounts, run by malicious actors, pushing out specific narratives and causing all types of problems. And so I'm going to give some examples as well. You can obviously find more information on the Cyabra website, on our blog and our reports, where we publish almost on a weekly basis more examples of what we're covering, because really this does seem to be the fastest growing area of disinformation in terms of the sheer number of the growth of this activity. And so the first one might be, we're going to go through all 5. The first one might be a polarizing decision made by a company, made by that brand. And it might be a decision that they've made, or the perception of a decision they've made. It might be something like a new policy that they've had, or something that they've actually published that may or may not be controversial and real, or I'm certainly not, with all of the examples I'm going to give, I'm certainly not weighing in as to whether they are correct or incorrect. I'm merely pointing out the research that we've uncovered of how there might be actual genuine negativity, unhappiness around this, and some of that conversation might be taking place on social media. But there's a difference between that and the sheer number of fake accounts that are now being deployed in order to amplify and turn this into a much bigger issue. So we saw, for example, Planet Fitness, and there was some conversation about introducing transgender individuals to changing rooms, and there was a conversation about it, and those are the conversations we kind of see. It's also when companies, DEI is a topic where brands are engaging more and more, and really picking up the mantle and taking the decision to get involved in those kinds of conversations, and many people are applauding that, but they are also aware that they're running into risk. So if you are in communications, corporate communications, PR for these brands, that it's kind of as dangerous as ever. And that's without accounting for the way that the conversation can move on social media. And so specifically with Planet Fitness, we actually saw that in the first few days of the discussion that moved online, that actually out of the whole conversation around the specific hashtag boycott Planet Fitness, 19%, nearly 1 in 5 of the profiles across social media that were discussing this and were using that specific, very negative hashtag were in fact fake accounts. And they were really driving a lot of the conversation. We saw, consequently, I'm not, of course, saying it's just purely the only reason for the fall in their share prices because of the fake accounts, but we certainly see the contribution of the fake accounts to drive the narrative, and they are then creating this bigger snowball. Of course, part of that snowball is where journalists, the media, other analysts might be looking themselves at social media. They're keen observers of social media, and seeing themselves the fake accounts, and presuming or thinking that they are actually real, because of course not just the brands are unable to be able to uncover the proportion of real and fake, but the journalists are also in this situation, so they might might be taking it as given, as real. And we see a lot of those examples where journalists are seeing what's taken the conversation on social media. They are writing about it. They're including examples of accounts amplifying and discussing it and shouting at the brand, but actually it's not real. And that becomes that turns into its own snowball. The way that media are covering these topics, looking at these topics, and then they're amplifying a certain viewpoint. So it can really begin, or it can actually be amplified on that. So that was 19%. And with John Lewis, they brought out some advice, a store magazine for staff members around the same kind of topic, or similar topic. And again, there was negativity around that. But we saw with that, in terms of the conversation, 24% of the accounts that use the hashtag boycott Waitrose, which is John Lewis is the parent company of that. And there were similarly high levels of the hashtag boycott John Lewis. 24, nearly 1 in 4 accounts was actually fake. Now, we're pretty sure that the brand themselves weren't aware of that. And so they themselves may have been monitoring the conversation and are now making decisions of what to do next based on false information, based on fake activity. And so that's just one example when a company has made a decision and then the fake accounts have plowed into and waded into that conversation in order to push a certain perspective that now other people might think is the given, the uniform opinion of everyone. The second one is geopolitical issues, be it geopolitical conflicts, and there is always a big event going on, whether it's wars, whether it's elections, whether it's whatever activity that people feel very emotionally attached to, and brands might be affected. We see when the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were lots of brands that had their physical businesses in Russia, and some companies responded in brands that responded in different ways, and they were negatively attacked for continuing to do business in Russia. We see a lot of fake accounts that are engaging with that or defending, depending on the side that the fake accounts were pushing out. And so one example we saw is Balenciaga, and they had a campaign that involved the sexualization of teddy bears that were next to children. And so it was a campaign that an advertising campaign that many perceived to be of bad taste, and there was some unhappiness around it. But actually what we saw there, and what happened next, was what you would probably expect to happen. The brand Balenciaga actually took down the campaign, apologized, and said they weren't going to run anymore, and that it was distasteful. And you would have thought that's it, right? There were days in the past where you would thought a brand has done something that people have reacted negatively to it, and then they've apologized for that and they've taken it down. Case closed, that's it. Maybe taken a bit of a rap and learnt their lesson, and maybe taken a bit of a brand reputation hit. But actually what we saw here is that not only was there negativity, not only was there hashtags involving and calling for a boycott of the brand that was being amplified by fake accounts, but in fact, what we saw here is Balenciaga started to be on social media involved in and quoted in conversations across social media around a wider conspiracy theory around a global cabal of pedophiles, and names such as Jeffrey Epstein were being thrown out there, and many real and also fake accounts were actually using their advertising campaign as a proof point in their eyes of the fact that there is this global cabal and they are trying to normalize pedophilic activities in their opinion. And so this campaign that in the past would have just been a campaign and they would have taken it down, we still see conversations around Balenciaga linked with that. And it's being driven by fake accounts and these false narratives. So again, if you're Balenciaga, how do you respond to that? They may have thought in the past that they have dealt with that, but actually it continues to rumble on a year later, which is pretty interesting and worrying as well, the way it's being used by certain individuals and parts of society to push certain opinions and conspiracy theories. So, Anna mentioned at the beginning, conspiracy theories around vaccines, around health. but there are certainly lots of conspiracy theories out there and conspiracists that are looking for their next example to be able to amplify. And we see influence operations and negativity and fake accounts being used to push out this specific one. So, Balenciaga was really, really interesting. Over the last couple of years, there's been huge economic shifts. A lot of countries have experienced recessions. The inflation has been increasing, and we see brands being involved in engaged with that and are on the kind of receiving end sometimes of global economic shifts that they can't always impact. But this creates a brand reputation risk. But specifically, we are seeing examples of brands where there is a certain proportion of real accounts, but it's being amplified by fake accounts. And so that's incredibly important to be aware of as these brands are responding. And one example was Loblaws, which is a Canadian retailer, and they're being accused of greedflation, of either increasing prices or keeping prices at the same level, or over and above the level of inflation. So they were actually profiting from the increased prices and using that as an excuse to increase their prices. And there has been lots of conversation around the world, and I'm sure people are thinking now, well, Rafi, the conversation about greedflation, and maybe there are some retailers who are engaging with that. But as a company, if you have made that decision and you are then being accused of it, you want to see where the conversation is going. In fact, you want to preempt that conversation. And so that kind of blew up a couple of months ago in Canada around the negativity towards Loblaws. But actually what we saw is that the negativity grew and was being amplified, and nearly 20%, around 18% of the conversation regarding Loblaws, specifically greedflation, around the period that the conversation grew and went viral, was driven by fake accounts. And so it was the inauthentic actors, inauthentic profiles. We saw some inauthentic content out there as well. And it was really pushing and amplifying this specific opinion about Loblaws. I mentioned earlier about how sometimes these then snowball when journalists get involved, but actually what we started to see was something incredibly worrying, was that a specific narrative and a specific call with Loblaws was put out there to have a day where it's acceptable to steal from the retailer. So we see this narrative about greedflation really taking hold, amplified by fake accounts, really having an impact. And we see the way that the fake accounts are really impacting the real people, the you and me. But then that kind of morphed into something a little bit, much more sinister, nefarious, and actually in a physical presence, where people were posting on social, fake accounts were posting, and they were amplifying calls for a specific day where it was perceived to be acceptable to actually steal from the retailer. And so that's something that the brand would have been very concerned about, and in fact would have been impacted in quite a serious way as people turned up on the day to steal from them because they felt it was justified because of the narrative that was being pushed out. I'm not going to go through all of these examples. Needless to say, with every single one of them, we've conducted analysis and found that there are certain narratives and how social media is being used to amplify and to be weaponized against these brands. And we're going to go in a minute through the examples or the reasons why, the occasions why we see that and who's behind it. The fourth one is actually where there might be certain hashtags that grow and snowball and go viral for reasons pretty much unconnected with the brand itself. What we see in the creation of bot networks of fake accounts in the A stage, the A and B stage of the ABC, is that accounts, in order to engage themselves with more people and expose themselves to more people, in order to build up a following, in order to appear more authentic, and also in order to fool and pass the algorithms of the social media accounts, often engage, as well as the narratives they're putting out, but they're often engaged with hashtags or content or conversations that are everyday. So you might find we see bot networks who are pushing out over the course of a few days in a very intensive way, a specific narrative, and they might post 600 times over the course of 48 hours, but then they might stop, engage in a different kind of conversation in a kind of apparent, hey, look at me, I'm not a bot, I'm just a normal person. I'm talking about going to the movies or going to watch football, whatever it may be. And so sometimes they also engage with the conversations that might be taking place and might be trending at that particular moment around a brand. And that's what we see here. Rip Curl, the retailer surfing brand, there was some negativity, a little bit of negativity, nothing that I think the brand would have considered an actual full-blown crisis. There was some negativity around a campaign that they had, and there were some calls, and in some countries for a small period of time, there was a call to boycott the brand. Now, we saw when Cyabra broke down the data over the course of a week or two, we saw some negativity and some increase of the conversations, and that was driven mostly by real accounts who had a gripe and who had an issue with the brand. But all of a sudden, over the course of 3 or 4 days, we see it increasing by 424%, driven by 19% fake profiles, thousands of fake accounts that were taking up a 20% fifth of the conversation almost, and they were latching onto this hashtag boycott Rip Curl. But who are they? Well, who are these kind of accounts? In fact, when we dug into it and we conducted analysis, we found that these bots had been created for the Indian general election that has just passed. So it was completely unrelated to the brand. They had no interest in the brand. They were created for another purpose around an election that was happening elsewhere. But the consequence was in their attempt to be more real, authentic, appearing more authentic, or to amplify their content to even more people, they will take whatever is trending at that moment. And it happened to be, unfortunately for Rip Curl, the boycott Rip Curl. So we saw a 424% increase of the conversation using this hashtag, but that virality was driven over that 3-4 day period. And then, of course, people started to take notice. Journalists started to report about it. But for the brand itself, it must have been very difficult and challenging to understand exactly what they're seeing and be able to differentiate between the good, the bad, and the fake. I'm going to fly through the last one now, which is money fueled. Right? It's not going to be any surprise that in terms of malicious actors, some of them are driven and motivated for financial reasons and are using social media to be able to try and make some money in a nefarious way. And so we've uncovered 2 examples recently. One where a significant amount of conversation over a short period of time were driven by fake accounts that were talking about the Intel stock price. That's not to say that they were the reason why the stock changed itself, but once there was a certain movement of the Intel stock, they certainly jumped into the conversation in order to be able to continue that movement, in order to be able to impact and affect the conversation. If you are protecting and looking after the brand of Intel or looking after their investor relations, then having nearly a quarter of all the conversation pushing a specific and untrue narrative is going to be particularly worrying. And on the other side is Netflix. And for legal purposes, we uncovered a bot network in Indonesia of fake accounts that were selling Netflix accounts. They were trying to make some money. They were trying to charge, or they were charging people for these cheaper fake logins into Netflix. But if you are responsible, again, for the brand reputation, firstly, there are people who might be impacted by that. They might be being spammed. And those individuals are probably going to be frustrated by Netflix, even though that's nothing to do with them. But also as well for Netflix, if you see that activity taking place, then it's going to be really concerning and something that you are going to want to shut down. So those are 5 different times filled with 10, 15, 20 examples of brands that have been impacted just over the last few months. Unfortunately, this is something that we are seeing more and more, which begs the question of who is behind it. Who are the people who are trying to push this? And I'm going to go very quickly through 4 of those. It may be others. And sometimes we get asked the question of, okay, well, who is behind disinformation? And I often give the analogy of, well, who's behind crime, right? You might have lots of different people. You might have people who are opportunistic. You might have state crime. You might have organized crime. And so I think that's a useful way of analogy of thinking about disinformation, because there might be many different actors involved, and they might be actually engaging in lots of different ways, as we saw with the Rip Curl example, nothing to do with it, created for other purposes, but actually brands are getting sucked into that in quite a impactful way. And so the first one is state actors, as most people will be aware of, as most people have an awareness and an understanding of in the audience. And I'm certainly sure that you do if you absorb and read any of the EU DisinfoLab content. And so they're aiming to influence and manipulate public perception. It's an election year. I don't need to say that again, even though I have. And so we certainly see an increase in all our analysis around pretty much every single election shows that the fake accounts engaging and creating more authentic looking and more authentic looking content is being pushed out there and is impacting so many people, as has been the case, although in slightly different ways this year. As has been the case for many years. And so state actors continue to see and use and weaponize social media for their own purposes. The other one is criminality, and we saw some examples of that being motivated by financial gain. I think we're definitely seeing an increase of that and the usage of Gen AI tools. I think we can probably think of examples in the past where, Bitcoin and crypto or certain phishing examples, and they were probably easier to spot because maybe the language wasn't quite right, the context, the grammar, something was a bit off. Now it's becoming easier to create fake accounts, easier to create fake content, and then you can certainly deploy them for financial gain, phishing, or the examples that we saw earlier. Then you have ideological, right? We saw those examples. There might be certain groups that are now ramping up and creating fake accounts for nefarious reasons in order to advance their specific ideological beliefs, whether that's around politics, whether that's around DEI or conspiracy theories. And so they are often emotive, they are often incredibly active and organized, even though they might act in pockets of society, but they are looking to challenge and disrupt entities they ideologically oppose. And for brands, the bad news is sometimes it might not even be something that they've done. It might be the perception of something that they've done or haven't done, or a position they've taken or haven't taken. And so that's something we're seeing an increase of at Cyabra. And then the fourth one is something that's not particularly new, but has been around, and again, is another example of Gen AI tools being used for pretty effective use of trolls. They're just looking to cause chaos for their own amusement. And we see lots of examples of that and isolated examples of that. And we can certainly expect to see much more of that. And just to put them in two different categories, which is, some of what we've covered so far today. And then I'm going to finish on this point and open up to questions. But we see it regarding whether it's to do with the brand itself, right? It's around a perception of a decision that they've made, or actually it might be completely collateral. It might be to do nothing to do with the brand, as we saw with Ripco, as we saw with those elections. And so it's important for individuals, for the brands themselves, as they're thinking about this challenge and they're thinking about how and the ways and when it might impact them. There might be many brands, and we are speaking to many brands that think, okay, well, we're not taking a decision on this, ideological or this political controversial topic, and so therefore we're going to be okay. But actually, more and more brands are finding themselves engaged in or being brought into or being impacted in ways that that they haven't been before, in ways that they can't really explain it, but it is impacting them, and the conversations around them and negativity around them, it is certainly increasing. So we don't have a huge amount of time, and we've covered quite a lot. There's obviously a lot more to cover, and as this worrying development on social media and the way that disinformation is continuing in the realms that we've known it to be, but actually now morphing and growing into new realms, is something that we've been tracking quite closely, and something that unfortunately I can report is on the increase and is impacting us more. That's not even, we haven't really touched upon individuals, us using social on a day-to-day basis, and how we might like brands and we might follow brands and we might be interested in what people are saying, and all of us as individuals, our experience on social media is being impacted in a negative way, which we haven't even covered today. And so that's another thing to think about. So I will open up to questions, and also just thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you, Rafi, for all the insights that you have brought today in this sort of X-ray of corporate disinformation. In a minute, we will start with the Q&A session. Please remember to use the Slido to raise questions and add any comments that you may have. In a minute, yeah, you'll see the code, the QR code to use this tool. You can either scan it or join at Slido #disinfo. Rafi, it's great to have this session today. Only a weeks ago, we were talking with another speaker about the fossil fuel industry misleading through advertising. Now it's different, but the same topic. Let me ask you the basic. Which industries would you say are the most affected by disinformation and why?
I'm muted. I've committed that cardinal sin of muting myself and forgetting it. Apologies. As I was saying, there are certainly some industries that have more exposure. And I suppose it's useful the way that we've broken it down, because you can think for ideological purposes, there are going to be some obvious industries, oil and gas and energy, banking and finance, telecoms, that they might be impacted in ways that others might not be. But similarly, and unfortunately, actually, when brands are impacted in ways that they couldn't expect and couldn't predict, that's also something that might happen. So whilst, yes, there might be some industries that are likely to be affected more, for those that aren't in that industry, I'm not sure you can rest quite as easy.
Okay, thank you, Rafi. We have around 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm happy to open the session. Let's go with the first one. During the pandemic, vaccine producing companies were targets of disinfo. To what extent do you think these were campaigns orchestrated by external state actors?
Wow, that's a great question. I think it's worth giving the caveat from Cyabra is that we collect publicly available information. So it's, whilst we can certainly pick up the breadcrumbs, right, the clues and the behaviors that some state actors show over others, we're actually later in the year, we're going to be publishing content, publishing analysis on the differences between Russia conducted fake accounts compared to China conducted, compared to Iran fake accounts, and there are actually differences between them. Having said that, it's not possible to be able to pinpoint exactly where it's coming from, exactly who's behind it, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why it's so effective and used so widespread and why it's increasing. But I think it's highly likely that it was conducted by some state actors. There has been some reporting on that, both from various countries around the world. But I think particularly around vaccine and health, that's probably an example where we see the merging, the crossroads of multiple motivations. So there might be some people that were looking to do it for financial reasons, buying cheap vaccines or whatever, or not, or taking other ailments that weren't recommended, but also as well, it might be state and it might be ideological. And so unfortunately, I think that it's the obvious example that comes to mind in terms of pandemic vaccine related topics and disinformation, because I think you saw a convergence of so many different motivations at the same time. And so, yes, as well as others is the answer to that question.
Thank you, Rafi. I'm going through all the questions. I'm trying to organize them by topic. So yeah, I think a follow-up question to this one would be, would you say that the purposes of damaging a company by spreading fake news about it are only financial?
The dangers facing companies are only financial? I think there are lots of dangers. I mean, how do you put a figure on brand reputation? I think there might be financial, depends the size of the company. If you're publicly traded, we're seeing this impact indirectly, because you can't always say that it's solely due to that the share price is being impacted. But we see share price, we see general interest or perception. And to be completely honest, I think, Anna, the example you gave at the beginning of this webinar where you spoke about a drinks brand, and that still springs to mind, however much time later. And so I think, that there might be still people years later that are thinking that and making that kind of decision. So I definitely think it's damaging companies, and it's unhelpful and harmful, both for financial purposes. I suppose there might be competitors that are doing it as well. You might have a whole range. If it's okay, Anna, just to pick out some of the other questions, I can see communications agencies.
Yeah.
I think the good news is, both in terms of as a society, we're becoming more aware of this and more educated about it. And as it is unfortunately becoming more prevalent, but I think communications agencies who are often on the front line are recognizing that they don't necessarily have the tools. I'm not advocating that the crisis handbooks need to be ripped up and started again, but I think many of the communications agencies, specifically those that have bigger teams of analysts who are dedicated into looking at the sources and really delving into the data and the numbers, and so they are probably really well placed in order to be able to respond as to what to do next. But of course, the question is are they able to identify the problem? So, for example, you might have a campaign that's turning negative. Now, if you're a communications agency, just to give that one example, you will probably want to do many things, but two things at the same time. You'll probably want to look at who is real and being positive about you, and therefore you can amplify and engage with them. But also on the other end of the axis, you will probably want to identify not just the fake accounts, but which fake accounts are having the biggest impact in terms of driving the conversation and having the highest levels of engagement. So the idea of taking down thousands of fake accounts can be unrealistic and daunting, but actually maybe you might want to identify just the few hundred or a couple of hundred that are causing the biggest damage. Now, the combination of agencies who are well versed in that, especially crisis communications individuals, but they also need the ability to identify and uncover the difference between them, which is incredibly important. Often when a crisis happens, there is the temptation to jump on absolutely everything, but actually what you can do is ignore some things. You can continue to track other things, and then you can make decisions of what actually you want to act on, able to do and have been doing for a while. But with these new threats and new challenges, they need to be able to make that distinction.
Yeah, I think this reply would align with another question that we have about corporate disinformation is difficult to solve. It's verification, regulation, and media literacy enough, or do companies have to be prepared to face it no matter what?
I think they definitely have to be prepared. I think many companies are constantly in crisis mode, disinformation or not, and so they're pretty well versed in that. But I think they need to adapt and update and be ready for this form of that. I'm certainly not saying that people saying bad things about companies and that turning into a crisis is new, but we're seeing it in new and different ways. It's being fueled in new and different and fake ways. So it is very difficult to solve. And I think the person who's asked that question is whoever RM is, and it wasn't me, I can promise you, even though those are my initials. It's very difficult to do. It does involve, as they've said, a combination of different things, including media literacy, including the verification regulation. It's a big problem involving many parts of society and many aspects of society. This isn't just down to one entity that is at fault here. And also it's challenging because the techniques are constantly evolving. They're constantly morphing as you solve one aspect, they're onto the next one, such as their nature. So yeah, great question, and it is definitely all corporations should be prepared for this, getting ready.
AI question, this couldn't be missed. Can you tell us more about the issues that companies face due to the misuse of AI, which allows for video manipulation, voice cloning, deepfakes, and so on?
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning, definitely the technology itself and Gen AI is great and has huge potential for good. So we're not necessarily, we're not against the. I use it regularly. We're not against the actual technology itself. It's about the misuse, as the person has asked. And there are lots and lots of examples. I think particularly in with election season now and the build up to the US election in particular, we're seeing more examples of voice cloning, deepfakes, video manipulation. We're also starting to see it being used in maybe more humorous ways. I don't know if there's any soccer fans out there, but there's lots of examples of soccer managers and players or just sports players being interviewed after the game, and I've been sent now quite a few over the last couple of weeks, lots of examples. I mean, if you haven't seen it, check it out. Gareth Southgate, the England manager, I can't believe I've managed to get him in there in this webinar, but there's lots of examples of him actually in a really believable way giving a speech that actually turns out to be incredibly rude and inappropriate, isn't something that he would normally say at all. But it really takes a few seconds to realize that actually it's not him. Now, those are humorous examples, and we kind of sit back and laugh at that, but we can see there the potential. Again, if you're a malicious actor, you're going to be looking at that and thinking, great, how can I use that for bad? Having said that, I think the deepfakes, the voice video manipulation is the one that's often referred, or the examples that are referred to. But I think we should also be aware that the most used misuse of Gen AI is in fact text, and just be able to create different kinds of text and more believable text. For video manipulations or deepfakes, you might have to have actual recordings of individuals, so therefore it can be used only mostly for well-known people who have lots of content out there. But for text, that's being used on a regular basis, and the barriers are so incredibly low to be able to do that. So that's something to think about as you're seeing these examples. Yes, they're going to be used. They're going to be used for harm, but also in terms of the just text, the fake text, of being aware of what we're reading out there.
Thank you. So we have a question from Pierre. Have you found bot networks focused on social issues? For example, a bot network that latches onto DI conversations irrespective of the company being targeted?
Absolutely. There's a huge amount of conversation around DEI topics, as I've mentioned. Not all of it is around brands, but I think sometimes when specific examples, specific individuals, and also the brands themselves appear or are being latched upon as examples, then they become the obvious punching bags, and it gives people an opportunity, and bot networks an opportunity to really jump on that. So I think those are the obvious ones. Yes, there is a huge amount of conversation around these societal DEI topics of conversation. Anyone who's in communications, the conversation about DEI and what role it plays and how much emphasis when it's Pride Month, what do companies do? There's a lot of people that have been commenting. I've seen that brands have been less vocal this year compared to previous years, and that's because of the backlash or perceived backlash. But then how much of that conversation is driven by fake accounts? We've seen brands that have been impacted and have taken down campaigns or have or have apologized, but actually then they themselves are seeing the fake accounts, and so the fake accounts are being impactful in terms of driving it. So absolutely, Pierre, yeah, we are seeing a lot of that. I suppose when brands are being sucked into that web is when it's obvious to point out.
Rafi, do you have the impression that the scale of this information is difficult to track because it's monitoring tools, mainly video platforms like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube? Yeah, I mean, I guess he's talking about the inability to have access to data.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're talking particularly with regard to Gen AI content, if we go back to the ABC of disinformation, which is why it's such a useful framework and thinking about that. By the way, these are great questions. If we're thinking about the ABC, the C of the content, I think we are approaching the stage as a society where we are realizing that the ability to identify at scale fake content is very difficult and not getting closer. Cyabra, we've developed some tools to be able to identify fake text and images. It's not 100%, admittedly, and I don't think there's any tools out there that are 100% or anywhere near that. I think the companies and technologies that are behind the LLMs and the Gen AI tools themselves don't have an accurate way of identifying the fake content or the content that's been created on their own platforms. So if we think of the ABC, if the sea is the Wild West, as it were now, of that content, and it's becoming harder, and we're going to get to a stage where we recognize society where it's just too hard to be able to recognize that at scale, and they become harder to spot, then actually that places a lot of the conversation back on A. And that's something worth considering, that the fake accounts are often the vehicles, they're the Trojan horses to spread the fake content. And if it's becoming harder to identify the fake C, then we can look at the fake A. There was an example last year or earlier this year of tweets that came, or a post from X that came, that put out an image of the Pentagon on fire, an explosion at the Pentagon. And actually our analysis showed that it wasn't fake accounts that amplified it. It was actually real accounts in the first few hours that amplified that, because they thought it was real. They were duped. And that had an impact that day on the stock market. There was a huge swing as the stock market reacted to what they thought was actually happening that wasn't. And that was in a fake image, and it looked incredibly believable. But what was missed about that conversation is that it was spread by an impersonation account, and it was impersonating Bloomberg News. It was called Bloomberg Institute, and it looked very real. Obviously, the account was taken down. It had probably been up for a number of weeks and months. And so that was a fake account. And so if it's hard to in real time identify and catch the fake content, then actually we need to start upping the and focusing on the A as well.
Okay, let's move on. We have 3 minutes and a few more questions. I find this one pretty interesting. Many brands advertise on websites that spread hoaxes, even if they don't want to be associated with this type of content. Consumers actually care that the brands they buy support this problematic content. Like, I guess they're talking about these automatic programmatic digital advertising tools where they fall whatever. So do you think people tend to stop betting on products that companies support disinformation?
I think the way I see that personally is kind of a subset of the wider challenge. I think the particular issue and the thing that in my opinion we should be focusing on is the way that, due to programmatic advertising, that there might be certain sources that have got ads running on them that actually might be part of the wider challenge and the wider infrastructure of disinformation. And so people might have issues about certain websites and news sites that have a very strong political opinion, and I think that's very fair for them to raise that as a topic, and also how much the consumers know of where their content is, and so therefore by definition they are giving their dollars to these problematic websites. I think that's fair for people to talk about, but to extend that further, I think it's also about and we're seeing this more and more. There was something in the BBC, I think, earlier today, and we've worked with the New York Times who have covered this as well, about fake news sites. The whole site is actually Gen AI content created news sites. It might not all be conspiracy theories. It might be also talking about societal issues, but they're being created using these tools, and they are being created for nefarious intent in order to be able to put out specific narratives that then take hold on social and are being amplified on social. And they also might have advertising on them. So I think that's the particularly sharp end of the issue that I think also should be focused on.
I believe we have time for one more question. Very brief reply, please, Rafi. And I think this is very interesting, especially for our community, for our audience. To what extent can this information about a brand can be weaponized, or I would say instrumentalized, to push an agenda with other interests that go beyond just harming the brand itself? Have you seen this?
Absolutely. And I think if there's one thing that people take away from this talk, is that the challenge for society is not just that the brands that we like are being impacted. I mean, if you work for that brand, that's going to be the thing that keeps you up at night, right? But if we're taking a step back and we're looking at the wider societal issues here, it's the way that certain agendas, certain narratives, and possibly even conspiracy theories are being pushed and are taking hold and being spread en masse in ways that it just wasn't previously possible, using techniques that are more advanced than ever to be able to push those specific agendas. Now, the examples I've given today are how brands are being impacted by that, and how those kinds of techniques and agendas are brands are finding themselves on the receiving end. But I think the bigger picture and the more important conversation to have here is how social media is being weaponized to push specific agendas. And of course, it's worth pointing out that the impact of that is the erosion of social discourses, the erosion of trust in society generally. Obviously, it's the kind of polarization of specific topics, but just the general trust. And I suppose, to finish on this point, I would challenge anyone to open up their phone now, go into any social media platform of their choice, and if they fully trust everything they're seeing, great. Well done to you. But actually, if you are seeing within the first 30 seconds something that you're not sure is real and might not look completely right, then we have a problem. We have a big problem that needs to be addressed. So I'm so sorry for finishing on such a negative. I wish it was more positive. Maybe next time we can come on and we can talk about more positive topics, but maybe that's the thought that I would leave you all with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafi. Thank you again for sharing all this knowledge, but really through real case studies, it greatly enhances our understanding. And I'm confident the counter disinformation community will take notes of your insights, and that monitoring disinformation that targets brands, it's certainly essential because they go beyond different dimensions. So an immense thanks also to our audience. Stay tuned because next week we are having another webinar. Beatriz Marin from the European External Action Service and Clement Brimes from Record the Future will guide us through a new Russian influence operation, false facade, copycat. Before leaving, please, an extra minute, you'll have access to a rating survey at the end of the webinar. And in that survey, you can also suggest future topics to be covered in our EU DisinfoLab series of webinars. We hope to see you around. Don't forget that the registration to EU DisinfoLab annual conference to be held in October in Riga is already open. Rafi, thank you very much again. Thank you to Cyabra. Thanks to all the dear.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Ciao.